Well, good morning, everyone, again. Happy Sabbath to you all. I have a message prepared for you this morning that I want to give, and we have the Passover coming up in, I don't know if it's 6 or 7 weeks, I've kind of forgotten, but it's very close, and we're getting closer to it. And as long as we keep on the same schedule, I speak again in 2 weeks, but we'll find out if that stays the same. This is a two-part message. This is a first-part sermon on the fullness of times. This deals specifically with the way that the world was when Jesus entered into the world. And so we're thinking about the Passover coming up. And of course, Jesus had to be brought into this world to be sacrificed as our Passover. So we're going to look at the way the world was through the lens or through the eyes of how Augustus Caesar ruled the world. In a couple of weeks, we'll look at King Herod. But right now, we're going to take a look at this. So I wanted to cover this today and think about how things were 2,000 years ago. We live in crazy times today, but things were very crazy back then 2,000 years ago. So let's look at this world. Let's consider some of the challenges that he was born into and the spirit of the age in which he died. I'd like you to look at Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4 to begin. This will be the springboard to my message here in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. Paul writes to the church at Galatia. He says in verse 3 here of Galatians 4, "Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law." So this kind of leads into where we're going to go today. There was a fullness of time that the Father had determined was to occur, or needed to occur, in order to bring forth his Son into this world to become the Savior of all mankind by taking on our sins so that we might present ourselves to God as a holy vessel. And the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew are the only two Gospels that contain the infancy narrative. In other words, the narrative or the information that surround the birth of Jesus Christ. There's a little bit of difference between the two narratives, and I like to treat them separately as I described before, because there's two different perspectives. But let's look at the account contained in Luke chapter 2 to set the stage. So if you look at Luke chapter 2, we're going to look at this particular viewpoint for this sermon. Luke chapter 2 and verse 1, and we'll read down through verse 7. Luke chapter 2. "It came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one to his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them at the inn." This conjures up a lot of images, I'm sure, in your mind, which we're not going to go over a lot of the details here today, but we have been so accustomed in this world to think of the Christmas image here that I'm sure some of these things kind of flash across the forefront of your mind about this Christmas image. It's not quite the way that today. It's quite different. But Luke mentions the name of someone very important in the world that he is juxtaposing Jesus with. Notice the text reads, Caesar Augustus. Now, Luke was written possibly around 60 AD, which means that his audience would have been living under the 5th Roman emperor at the time, or you can look at it from the perspective of about 45 or so years after the death of Caesar Augustus. This would be equivalent to, for instance, maybe the end of World War II to about 1990, or maybe today back to about 1975, 1976, somewhere in that region. That's how far back we're looking as far as time frame goes. So with Augustus being the first emperor of the Roman Empire, it's likely that they would all be familiar with him at that time. You're familiar with things that happened 40, 45 years ago. It would be similar to me saying, for instance, if I said to you, in the days of Jimmy Carter, things come to your mind immediately. Or if I said in the days of Ronald Reagan, you have an image, you have an idea of what was going on at that time in history, what was happening. In the days of Barack Obama, you have things that come up that you think about. In the days of Abraham Lincoln, there are things that you consider at that particular time. So you don't really have to say much else. You don't need a PhD in history, in other words, to understand a little bit about some of the events that transpired during the time of those presidents. You don't need to hear the name of the person you only need to hear the name of the person or a major event to evoke what happened during that time in the days of the American Revolution. Wow. I kind of know what's happening, okay? So you say, well, I know what time frame we're talking about and what things surrounded that time. You would totally understand the context now, wouldn't you? You get that. Well, that's precisely what Luke did when he says, in the days of Caesar Augustus. Everyone in the first century would get this. They would understand what was going on. Us, not so much. It's so far removed from us, we don't really get that too much unless we've studied it, learned it, read about it. So what I want to do today is to help us understand what the first century world understood when they heard these words in the days of Caesar Augustus, is to go through some of this. Because until we understand him and what he was up to and why he was on the throne as the first emperor of Rome, we won't fully understand the significance of the birth of Jesus Christ at this particular epoch in history. So let's start with the backstory. The backstory starts with the Roman Empire. Make sure we got our first slide up. The Roman Empire under Augustus. So this was the Roman Empire around the time of Caesar Augustus. And he ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD and was the emperor when Jesus was born. Now the question is, how did they get all of this control? How did they cover all this green area? How did Rome control all this territory? And the answer is through military conquest, through military might. Rome captured their territories through battles. They ruled from England all the way down to, you can see, Britain all the way down to Iran. And it started in 753 BC. That's when Rome was founded according to mythology. And the Roman Republic was around 509 BC. But it wasn't until 146 BC, at a place called Carthage, that Rome began to send a signal to the rest of the world that they meant business. Here's Carthage in 146 BC. You can see that off the tip of Africa there across from Sicily. So they had conquered Carthage, which was a very powerful nation at the time, a very wealthy nation due to the trade routes. You can see, everything has to pass right through that area to be able to travel over south of Spain to get out to the Atlantic Ocean. So it was a very prosperous nation at the time. At the same time, the same year, they took out Corinth. They defeated Corinth, which was the main city of Greece at that time. And so now all of a sudden, the Mediterranean world is really getting concerned because they now conquered Carthage, very powerful nation, and they conquered Corinth. And then 13 years later, which isn't that much time really, 13 years goes by quickly, they took all of Asia Minor, what is today now called Turkey, and then in 63 they take Israel. You can see Israel there, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and in 30 AD or 30 BC, I should say, they took Egypt. You can see Egypt right there as well down on the bottom left. And at that point, they're the uncontested rulers of the world. They took all of this land through military might, through power, through war. And there are some early poets and historians of the Roman Empire that give us some insight on how they conducted their business at that time. Now, the principal poet at the time of Caesar Augustus was Virgil. Many of you have heard of Virgil, maybe you've read some of his writings. But I want you to notice what he says about Rome, about how Rome is to rule the world. This is Virgil. You, O Roman, remember to rule the nations with might, This will be your genius, to impose the way of peace, to spare the conquered and crush the proud. This is how you do it. And according to the Roman mentality, the way you bring peace in the world is through the sword. And this is one of the ways that they communicated their message in the world. So if you wanted to communicate a message to the world, you didn't send out an email. You didn't watch television. You didn't send it out on commercials. There was no tweets that would go out. There's no Facebook. There's nothing like that. It didn't exist at the time. So if you wanted to communicate a message, one of the ways and quickest ways for it to be done was through coinage, because it circulated everywhere. You could send out letters and proclamations, but coinage was very important. Even on our coins today and our bills today, we have the, very prominent people. It sends a message out to the community. So they circulated it throughout the empire. And one of the coins during the reign of Caesar Augustus is this one right here. You can see it. On the front side is the Roman goddess Pax. And then she's the Roman goddess of peace, which is kind of interesting. But here's why it's so interesting, because they show you on the opposite side how they gain the peace. On the other side, we have Caesar Augustus, and it's divine Caesar Augustus. You can see D-I-V-I on that right side, Caesar on the left, and you can see Caesar Augustus standing there with, he's dressed up in military garb, right? Very warlike military outfit with a spear in his hand. So this is the symbolism, can't be more clear. The way that you get peace and you hold peace in the Roman Empire is that you crush nations and you crush people. It's been said that Carthage was the first case of genocide the world had ever seen. And this is the style of rule and conquest they followed to gain all the territories of the earth that they gained. Tacitus was a Roman senator and historian of the Roman Empire, and though he came shortly after the writing of Luke, this is what he recorded about the major Roman general during the reign of Caesar Augustus, Germanicus. Germanicus was one of the greatest generals of the Roman Empire and was known for coming into areas and absolutely decimating the areas. This is what Tacitus wrote about Germanicus. For 50 miles around, he, that is Germanicus, wasted the country with sword and flame. Neither age nor sex inspired pity. Places sacred and profane were razed indifferently to the ground. Only the destruction of the race would end the war. Very staggering. That's from, I think I have the source down there. A Greek historian by the name of Polybius, who was an eyewitness to the sacking of Carthage, said this. So he's an eyewitness. He said, "It seems to me that they do this for the sake of terror." The Romans employed an ancient equivalence of shock and awe and terrorized people into submission of their peace. So you see, beginning with Caesar Augustus, Roman emperors were considered gods. They were gods. And if your community did not recognize them as such, then the army would come in and they would loot and they would rape and they would pillage and burn a community. And those leaders, usually the leaders, almost always the leaders, were especially obstinate to the Romans. They would deal with them harshly. They would crucify them. And they would crucify them as an example. See, the Romans didn't invent crucifixion. That was likely the Persians, but the Romans perfected it. They bragged that they could keep a person alive on the cross for 3 days without dying. This is how they terrorized people. Quintilian was a Roman educator that wrote this about the crucifixion. Whenever we crucify the guilty, the most crowded roads are chosen where the most people can see and be moved by this fear. For penalties relate not so much to retribution as to their exemplary effect. Josephus also wrote this. He said, in 4 BC, after destroying villages and slaughtering their residents, Varus had his soldiers round up the leaders of the insurrection and crucified about 2,000. So we're not talking about 10 or 20, or just, 100 or more. We're talking about thousands, and they would run out of trees to hang people up on these trees to be crucified. because they wanted to make a statement so that everyone understood that Rome is your ruler. Tacitus wrote this: "You have sought in vain to escape the Romans, oppression by obedience and submissiveness. They are the plunderers of the world. If the enemy is rich, they are rapacious. If poor, they lust for dominion. Not east, not west. They rob, butcher, plunder, and call it empire. And where they make a desolation, they call it peace." This is how the Romans worked. This is how they conquered all the lands that they conquered. This is the empire that was ruling the world back in the day. This is the world that Jesus was born into. The world had never seen an empire this large, this massive to this point in history. The Roman Empire in various forms would last for more than 1,600 years. No one had seen anything like it. Now, when Jesus was born, Augustus was emperor of the world. But the question is, how did he get there? This is the interesting backstory as well. Rome had up to that point been known for its republic, for its democracy. It didn't have one-man rule. It had a democratic Senate, I guess, that they would vote on things. But now we have an emperor on the throne. So how did the empire begin? Well, to see how Rome went from republic to empire, we need to begin with none other than Julius Caesar, the inventor of the Caesar salad. It's a little-known fact of history you never knew anything about. That's not true. That's fake news, by the way. Don't mistrust me just because I said that. Anyway, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was never an emperor, but his name was used for the emperor. But it begins here. He was a Roman general who had been in a civil war with another Roman general by the name of Pompey. This is the one, I think I have one of Pompey here. Yep. This is the one who came into Israel in 63 BC and claimed Israel for Rome. So these two generals are going at it, and Pompey was assassinated in Egypt, and Julius Caesar is now the one who has the power militarily. So he's part of the Senate partially because of his family standing and his conquests, but the amount of power that he had made the Senate very concerned about him. So they were so concerned, in fact, that the Senate, by the way, if you haven't seen the movie, spoiler alert, all right? You might want to close your ears if you want to watch the movie. But they killed him in unison. The Senate did. There were two main people behind the plot. There was Brutus, who was a protege of Julius Caesar, and there was Cassius. And they killed him on the Ides of March 15th. William Shakespeare has a play on this, Julius Caesar. So Octavian, I'm sorry, go back for a second. So now from 44 BC, there are several events that transpire to the making of Caesar Augustus. And in 44 BC, so we have Julius Caesar, he is assassinated. And in his will, he leaves his adopted son, Octavian, who will become Augustus Caesar, all of his worldly belongings, including his offices. So Octavian is the great nephew of Julius Caesar. And Octavian will become known as Caesar Augustus. And then in 43 BC, a second triumvirate was formed. So we have Octavian, we have Mark Antony, or Anthony. I'm wearing Mark Antony socks today. Different people. Mark Antony. And we have Lepidus. So this was the second triumvirate. The power of Rome is effectively in the hands of these three generals you see right here. And the Senate is still there, but its power is now beginning to wane. And in 42 BC, Julius Caesar is officially deified by Senate by decree, by the Senate by decree. And after the death of Julius Caesar, there were some celestial events that were occurring, or that had occurred fortuitously. A comet came around, and it shone brightly in the sky for 7 days. It was considered the brightest comet ever recorded in history at that time, and it was called Caesar's Comet. Today, we don't call it Caesar's Comet, we call it Halley's Comet. as it comes back, repetitively at certain intervals. So we have this comet, and Octavian himself had declared it the spirit of Julius Caesar ascending to the right hand of the Most High God in heaven, which at that time was Jupiter, because Caesar was in fact divine. 2 years later, the Roman Senate agreed with Octavius. This was Julius Caesar. And if Julius Caesar was God and Octavian was the son of Caesar, then Octavian could now claim the title Son of God. And he would play off this in a big way. That's Halley's Comet. So in 19 BC, a Roman coin was struck with Caesar Augustus on the head. And then on the other side, an image of the comet, you can see that there, that would promote the image that his father was a god and that he was known as the Son of God. Also in 42 BC, Octavian and Antony defeat Brutus and Cassius at Philippi. Actually, they commit suicide, killing themselves on the battlefield, but this effectively avenges the death of Julius Caesar for Octavian. And then in 36 BC, as we get closer to the birth of Christ, Lepidus was removed from power by Octavian in a political move. So that leaves really Octavian, and then we have Mark Antony, right? Vying for power in the Republic. And a great deal of tension has to do with the relationship that Mark Antony has with none other than Elizabeth Taylor. You may recognize this from, is the movie called Cleopatra? I don't remember. But Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, and that was Mark Antony on the right. I don't remember who played that. Who is that? Richard Burton, thank you. Yeah, so there, actually that is not the real Cleopatra. There is a bust of Cleopatra right there. So Mark Antony, Cleopatra had this love relationship. It created a lot of problems between he and Octavian. And so then in 31 BC, there was the Battle of Actium. And then, is that what I've got? Yeah, the Battle of Actium. And Octavian defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra. But after this defeat, Antony and Cleopatra, they flee to Egypt. And Octavian will follow them and defeat them one more time in 30 BC. And at this time, Antony and Cleopatra commit suicide. Now there's no one left. Octavian has all the power. So in the world at this time, we have Italy here, and you can see Italy on the left, or Greece actually, you can see right there, across I'm not sure which bay that is or which water body that is, over to Turkey or Asia Minor. Basically, everything to the east is run through Asia Minor because the seat of power is right where the seven churches of Revelation are. That's where the seat of power at that time resided. The elders of Asia had sided with Mark Antony. Well, that was a problem, wasn't it? They sided with the wrong person. And so now they're scrambling because they chose the wrong side, and they went to Octavian. They had to do something, so they went to Octavian, and they told him they picked the wrong person. They didn't want to lose their power. And there is evidence, actually, that they weren't just sucking up, that they really believed that Octavian was the selected and chosen one to rule the world. That they really believed that. And he was the one that was to bring peace and prosperity to a fractured world. And they were so serious about that they said to Octavian, you know, you're very smart, you're very strategic, and in fact, you are divine yourself, and so we want to erect, for the very first time in history, a temple for emperor worship for you, Octavian, and we want to put it in Pergamum. And you can see that up there at the top Pergamum in the capital of Asia. So now Octavian was very shrewd. He was very shrewd, and he recognizes back in Rome that the Senate is very concerned that they're going to lose their power, and wondered what is going to happen to their cherished republic. So Octavian says to the elders of Asia in a very diplomatic way, listen, I'll give you the right to erect a temple to me in Pergamum as long as you erect a temple to my father Julius Caesar and to Roma, the personification of the Roman Republic, as joint temple at Ephesus and Nicaea. And if you do that, and you can erect a temple, then you can erect a temple to me in Pergamum. He was a very shrewd man. So in 29 BC, the first temple of emperor worship, where people can come from around the world and worship Octavian, the Son of God. They could come do that. 2 years later, in 27 BC, Octavian goes to the Senate because they're getting more worried than ever before. And he said, listen, he says this to the Senate, I understand, that you're all very concerned. And for the glory of Rome, I am willing to give back some of my, in fact, a great deal of my power to keep the direction of the Republic going, because he said it's moving in the right direction. And we want it to continue to move in this good direction. We're having a peace in the empire that we haven't had before. And so, or the Republic at the time. So the Senate says, it's moving in a good direction, and the civil wars are mostly coming to an end. And they said that since he was willing to give up his power, they liked that. And so rather than taking that power back, they rejected it, and so they gave him all power, and the Republic now becomes an empire for the first time in history, and they convey upon Octavian the title of Augustus, which means great or venerable one, which carries now religious overtones to it. And so he takes the name of his father, his adopted father, and is now called Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of the Roman world. Let me just interject here, something I was thinking about. I don't know why I've never noticed this before, but have you noticed that from all the turmoil that was about there, that it came that all these people gave their power to one man? And in the end time, we're going to see the same thing. We see 10 kings that are going to give all their power to one ruler for a period of time. This is an example of how some of these things could come about. Even in today's society, you see that even in our Congress, many are willing to give all their power to one man to have a dictatorial rule. So oftentimes we wonder, how's this going to come about? We have 2 examples, very clear of how these things could happen down in prophecy. So at this moment, people are beginning to talk about what this moment means and what they believe to be true about who Caesar Augustus is. And this is what they're saying now about Augustus. This is what Horace, a Roman poet, writes. Thine age, O Caesar, has bought back fertile crops to the fields. That might be broad. I might have that wrong. Has brought back fertile fields to the crops to the field. Has wiped away our sins and revived the ancient virtues. Wow. And the fame and majesty of our empire were spread from the sun's bed in the west to the east. As long as Caesar is the guardian of the state, neither civil dissension nor violence shall banish peace. Virgil writes as well, Lo, under his auspices, my son, that glorious Rome shall bound her empire by earth and her pride by heaven. This is he whom has so oft here promised to thee, Augustus Caesar, son of a god, who again set up the golden age. This is the one that has brought about all things, Augustus Caesar. Here's an inscription I want to show you that was found in southwest Turkey in a place called Priene. This is at least 3 or 4 years before the time of Christ. Pre-Ane inscription reads this: since providence has ordered all things and is deeply interested in our life, has set in most perfect order by giving justice whom she filled with virtue that he might benefit mankind, sending him as a Savior, both for us and our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things, and since he, Caesar, by his appearance, excelled even our anticipations, surpassing all previous benefactors, and not even leaving to posterity any hope of surpassing what he has done, and since the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the gospel, the good news for the world. Right, so he's set himself up. Obviously, he's the Son of God. He's preaching the gospel, the good news. So there's a section of this that is called the Pre-Ane calendar inscription. You see that? Yes. Okay. The Greek word for the gospel is euangelion, which is also where we get the word evangelism and evangelist from. And they said that this is the good news of Caesar Augustus, the beginning of the gospel of Caesar Augustus, or the good news. By the way, how does Mark begin his biography on the life of Jesus? You can turn there if you'd like to. I don't have it up here as a slide, but I can read it to you. In Mark chapter 1 and verse 1, his very first words in the Gospel of Mark says this. Look at what it says compared to the Pre-Ane inscription. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So what are the writers doing? What are they doing? I think they're helping us see that when Jesus comes on the scene, that we have a clash of gods. We have Caesar, the Son of God, and we have Jesus, the Son of God. Now, if you wanted to break down Caesar Augustus into a few talking points based on the literature, what was written about him and said around the kingdom, here's what they would be. Caesar Augustus, a divine Son of God who comes with the gospel of good news, of peace and prosperity for the whole world, the Pax Romana. He brings salvation for humanity, and he brings the forgiveness of sins. This is what Augustus was credited for, the peace of Rome. Now, when you look at this, you have to be thinking, what's going on here? This is the language that we use for Jesus Christ, and it was used before Jesus Christ was even born. So there's a salient point here in that the description is the same, which makes it a choice between two. One is a fraud, and one is the authentic Son of God, and you can't have both. When we were in Israel, Max and I were in Israel, we went to Jerash, to the temple of Artemis. And you walk up those steep steps, and you go to the platform that's flat, and you walk up the steps again into that temple. And I remember the same thing happened when we were there in 2005. There's always people there, natives, that were selling coins. They claimed to be authentic coins that they found right there at the temple of Artemis. And I remember looking at a couple as we were trying to get to be going, and they had one of supposedly of Caesar Augustus, and I don't remember the other one. And I looked at these coins, and man, they looked authentic to me. I didn't know any better. They were kind of dirty and kind of worn, and the edges were rough. If it was an authentic coin, you got me on it. So he wanted $45 for the two coins. I think he wanted more. He probably bargained him down to that. And we were getting ready to go, and I thought, I'll just, $45, that's fine. We're on a trip. If it's authentic, it's authentic. If it's not, it's not. And I kind of thought, well, maybe they were. And when I got home, and we started inspecting them under a microscope. Oh, by the way, we went to an antiquity shop and actually bought two coins. One was Augustus Caesar, and one was Constantine. And those were authentic coins. And when I started looking at them under a microscope very carefully, you could see the ones that I bought at the Temple of Artemis. They had some rust around the edges that I couldn't see unless I inspected it very closely. And it was kind of flaking, chipping away, which told me instantly this was a fake. But on the surface, as I looked at them, I couldn't tell the difference. I couldn't tell what was real and what was fake. And certainly I wasn't trained to do that, right? So it's kind of the same thing here. If you see this thing going on, you're thinking, well, I don't know what's real and what's fake, except for God's going to tell you what's real and what's fake. He's going to illuminate that to you. So what the writers have done is, in effect, they've made this a choice. You have to look at the two. Which one's real? Which one's not? And they illuminated why Jesus is the clear and correct choice. So there is all this language about Caesar Augustus and Paul when he writes in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, he says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. And we have a competitor on the scene. Two opposing rulers, and they function very differently. So can you see why Paul wrote in the fullness of times? In the fullness of times? Can you see why the pieces are coming together? Going back to the Old Testament for a moment, there was a series of events that occurred under the hand of God that set the stage for the coming of the Messiah. In 586, the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin were taken captive by the head of the gold image in Daniel chapter 2 from Nebuchadnezzar. So there are 3 deportations. The first one, I think, was 586. And the Jews were torn from the land in which they disobeyed God. But they had to get back to the land because there was a prophecy that had to be fulfilled, that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. And the Jews knew it, and of course God was not slack in his promises, so he set up another world-ruling power to then take over the Babylonians, and we know that was the breast of silver, that was the Persians, in that image of Daniel chapter 2. And so under the Persian rule, you had this man who in Daniel is called, no, it's not Daniel, I forgot where it was, Jeremiah, it's escaping me right now. He was called the Messiah. He was the Savior for the Jews because he was moved by God to send all the exiles back home. So this was 539 BC, 70 years after captivity. They were sent back, and they weren't just sent back home, by the way. He gave them money. He gave them money to go back home and to fund the building of the new temple. This had to be a very exciting time that was going on, being able to return back to the land and build the temple. And he not only did that, he returned all of the gold and silver temple cups that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple. So he gave all those back as well. So this was quite something amazing to behold, to be part of, I'm sure. And then in 336 BC, Alexander the Great takes the throne from his father Philip II, and he then conquered the known world in 13 years. In 13 years, he conquered the world. But to rule a world that large, he decided, I've got to have a way to get the message out. And so he decided, I need a unifying language. A unifying language would pull the world together. It would make trade and transactions easier. They didn't have to work through a bunch of different languages. It just made a lot of sense. So Alexander the Great mandated that everyone had to learn Greek. And this unifying language was going to become so important at a time when the gospel message was to go out to the world when Jesus came onto the scene. How convenient it was that the New Testament was written in Greek when the world knew Greek. And then when Rome came onto the scene, the empire brought about air quotes, peace. It brought about a peace, a Pax Romana, but a peace that came at the expense and brutality of those under the boot of the Romans. But the world was mostly stable at that point, and it's a stability that they had not seen in a long time. And the Romans made a contribution that really helped further the gospel message on top of the common Greek language. You see, in order to keep this Pax Romana in the empire, this peace in the empire, they needed ways to get the military to all the places around the empire, and they needed it quickly. How are you going to move all these things around? How do you move the troops around? How do you move the artillery around that they needed, all these weapons? And the way that they facilitated that was to build a road and a transportation system that would link the empire together. So I have a slide up of Roman roads. You see it? Okay. That's how you did it. This is how you link the empire together. Now, there were over 50,000, some sources will say up to 80,000, miles of high-quality roads in the empire. These are the same roads that Jesus and the apostles, including Paul, used to traverse throughout the empire to spread the message of the good news of the kingdom of God. You can see right here, here's some Roman roads that were built over 2,000 years ago, and they are still can be used today. They don't need to be asphalted over. They don't need to be ground down and resurfaced. That's them. Now, they don't carry the traffic that we carry, but it's a remarkable testament to what the Romans did that this thing still even exists in the world today. So these roads took this message out, the kingdom message, the gospel message out. And don't forget the idea that Augustus was considered to be a God-man. He was considered both man and God. Now, Egypt had the same concept in the pharaohs, but it was only localized. But with the Romans, it was everywhere. It was over the whole empire. This was an empire-wide idea that might have helped people understand that there could be such a thing. Jesus, though, was not man become God. He was God condescending to become man and offering up his sinless life so that you could become God. That's quite a difference, isn't it? This is Israel at the is a crossroads. If you were to pick up one location to birth a message in the ancient world, you would be wise to pick the most highly trafficked area in the world, and that would be Israel. Israel was a land bridge between Egypt and the rest of the world. It was a water bridge between the European continent and Asia through the Mediterranean Sea. You can see that if you wanted to go between Europe and Asia and Africa, you had to go through Israel. And there was a major highway that went through there, the King's Highway, if I remember that right, goes through the Galilee. Right? Major hub that goes through Galilee. Where did Jesus spend a lot of his time? He spent it in Galilee. So if you wanted to get your message out, you go to the center, and it spreads from there. And this is what happened. In the fullness of time, it is remarkable how God used this. God acted at the right time for his purposes. So with that understanding, I'd like you to go to Luke chapter 2. Make sure I got these out of order. Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2 and verse 1, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus, thinking about all the things that we've gone over, that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from the Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, or espoused wife, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. Now, when we hear census, we think that they would just travel so that they could sign their name to a registry and be counted in a number for the Roman Empire. And there may be some places where that's all it was done. But there's so much more to a census than that. Today, in our time period, we had a census taken last year in the U.S., and that census has lasting implications for years to come, for the next decade, because it tells and it determines where this money's going to go, because that's a lot of the things. So where's the federal money going to? Who's going to get federal grant money, for instance? Which states are going to get federal grant money? The appropriations for state money, where's it going to go in the districts or the cities? Who's going to get all that money? Where do you build your roads? Where do you spend your money making sure the bridges are okay? How do you plan for services, for social services? All based on the census. even down to congressional seating, redistricting, electoral college votes. Those are changed based on censuses as well. So the census has vast tentacles even in our society, and it did back then as well. The Roman census was no less important because to continue the Roman Empire, you need money. You need lots of money, and it was needed for the military to keep its peace and to continue conquering. And that came through taxes. And to determine how much to tax people, they had to get the subjects together and find out, what do you own? How much of it? Where is it at? Scholars estimate that Jews were taxed around 70% total. Now, today, I don't think we're taxed that high, although if you put everything together, I'd say it's a pretty high tax. The process of determining how much you made or how much you owned was not a fun process. I remember, I think it was a couple of years ago, they had valued our house at a certain level here in town. And I objected to that value because it raised my taxes up to a high level, and they overestimated it. And so when I went there to talk to the, not the assessor, thank you, to the assessor, I said, wow, this thing is really high. Why is it so high? And I see. They put your house at a Class A level. And I said, Class A? That's like way up there. And he said, well, we can put it to a Class B. So it lowered it down significantly on just changing the way that it was classed. And another thing that came that he was talking about some lady who came in and complaining about her taxes, and she was being really obnoxious to him. And I don't know why he said this to me, but he decided to tell me that he said to me, but he was thinking to himself, lady, he said, you're harassing me. And he said, don't you know that I can tax everything on your property? I can tax every tree and every shrub and every square inch of your concrete and every bush and every flower. He can tax everything. Now, he didn't, but he could do that. And it's staggering to think about all the things that they could tax. And so when you see the Jews, cutting down their trees, now you know why. Because all of the things that they tax, and it just runs the tax burden up. So they had to figure out what you owned. And like I say, this was not a fun process. Remember who you're dealing with. You're dealing with the beast power. This is a ferocious beast. This is what Lactantius wrote about the Roman census. He said, the census takers appeared everywhere and produced a tumult wherever they went. The fields were measured clod by clod. Every grapevine and fruit tree counted. Every head of livestock of every kind was listed. The exact number of people noted, and in the autonomous cities, the urban and rural population were herded together until the marketplaces were filled with the collected families. All came with their whole band of children and slaves. Everywhere was heard the screaming of those who were being interrogated with torture and beatings. Sons were forced to testify against their fathers, the truest slaves driven to bear witness against their masters, and wives against their husbands. When all other means had been exhausted, the victims were tortured until they gave evidence against themselves, and when pain had at last conquered, taxable property that did not exist was registered. Neither age nor illness won exemption. The ill and the infirmed were dragged before the examiners. Age was set down by estimate, and the age of tax-free minors was raised, while that of the old, who were likewise exempt, was lowered. The marketplaces rang with lamentations. Welcome to the Roman world. Welcome to Bethlehem. And in all this came forth in the fullness of time, a child was born. Luke chapter 2 and verse 8. And in the same region there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night, and an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. And the angel said to them, fear not, for behold, I bring you good news, real good news, great joy that will be for all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. Luke writes this is a new euangelion. Not the good news of Caesar Augustus, This is the good news of Jesus Christ. And this will bring great joy, not fear and trembling, and it will be not for some people, it will be for all people. You know, as I come to an end here, I want you to consider this very important point that we can see from this story. God is in control, even in this day and age. God is never early. He is never late. He is always right on time. And we know that we do not live in a perfect world, and it moves further away from God on a daily basis. This isn't the same world that you were born into 80 years ago. Not the same. Or 60 some odd years ago. It's not the same world. Or for me, 50 years ago. It's not the same world. And honestly, it's not the same world when Faith was born. It's just a different world now. The temptations are in many ways worse. The complications are more complex. You know, I think it was until the pandemic we were at the most prosperous time at any point in history, the lowest level of poverty ever recorded in history. And in many ways, even with the way things are going now, with the free money being given out, and if you want to call it prosperity, it's not true prosperity, but it seems that way. We have more prosperity than any time in history. We have more comfort. But it can also erode our faith in God and advance our faith in ourselves. This is definitely the most technologically glorious time in human history. And yet it's probably one of the most challenging times to live in. And because of technology, in some ways, we suffer more. And in some ways, we suffer less. We're more busy in many ways, and in some ways we're less busy, and it's not always a good thing. We can have more faith in God and yet have less faith as well because of what's going on. How do we respond to the times that we live in? We can't change the external world around us. We're not called to do that. But we can change the internal clock. We can change the way that we respond to those things. We can draw closer to God, or we can be pulled further away from Him because of many of the things that happen around us. And maybe this is why America is more polarized than ever before, because people rely on themselves rather than a heavenly creator. Sometimes, brethren, you may feel that God is not where you want Him to be in your life because of your circumstances. Well, I want you to know that He's there. I want you to know that He's right there. He's right there when you're busy, and sometimes you don't think about Him. He's there. And if you got nothing to do, He's there too. He's there when you're distracted, and He's there when you're not. And He's there when you're suffering, and He's there when you're not. And it's the good times. You see, brethren, if God's hand was involved in thousands of years of history to bring His only Son into the world at that time in order to bring about the forgiveness of sins through the death of His Son, then what involvement does He have in your life and mine? Why did He bring Jesus into the world in the first place? It was for you and was for me. That's the reason. And so if He's that concerned about about Jesus Christ being brought in, He's concerned about the reason that He brought Him in. He's concerned about all of that. And in your life, He is there as well. If His purpose is to regenerate us through Christ, then His hand is on us as well, guiding us through all things, all circumstances, all difficulties, all challenges, all worries, all environments, in all situations. He's there in every one of them. So as we participate in this thing called life, remember that you are not here by accident and that God has a purpose for you. And in that plan, he is never early. He is never late. But he is always right on time in the fullness of time.